In 1987, 4 lighthouse keepers vanished during a violent storm on Beacon Point Island off the coast of Maine. The lighthouse beam continued to sweep across the dark waters. The foghorn sounded its warning every 30 seconds, but the men who tended the light were gone. For 37 years, the mystery remained buried beneath Coast Guard reports and maritime records. Until last month, when demolition crews preparing to tear down the abandoned lighthouse made a discovery inside the walls that defied explanation: the mummified remains of the keepers and evidence of signals coming from deep beneath the ocean floor. Welcome to Lost Mystery Stories. Before we uncover what really happened on Beacon Point Island during that storm in 1987, tell me in the comments, have you ever felt like the ocean was watching you? And if you believe some mysteries are buried in the deepest waters, hit that subscribe button because this story will reveal what happens when lighthouse keepers discover they're not alone in the darkness. November 12, 1987. Beacon Point Lighthouse, Maine. Beacon Point Lighthouse had stood sentinel over the treacherous Maine coast for over a century. Built in 1884 on a rocky island 3 miles from shore, the 90-foot tower had guided countless ships safely through the notorious Widow's Reef, a jagged underwater formation that had claimed more vessels than any other hazard along the eastern seaboard. The lighthouse required a crew of 4 men to maintain its operations: a head keeper, 2 assistant keepers, and a maintenance technician. They worked in rotating shifts, with 2 men always on duty while the others rested or performed maintenance tasks around the island. The 4 men who vanished that November night were experienced maritime professionals who had worked together at Beacon Point for over 3 years. Thomas Brennan, 52, head keeper, 15 years Coast Guard service, 8 years at Beacon Point. Michael Santos, 34, assistant keeper, former Navy signalman, 4 years at Beacon Point. David Walsh, 28, assistant keeper, maritime engineering background, 3 years at Beacon Point. Robert Chen, 41, maintenance technician, electronics specialist, 3 years at Beacon Point. They were the best crew we'd ever stationed at Beacon Point, said Captain James Morrison, Coast Guard District Commander in 1987. Experienced, reliable, and they knew that lighthouse better than anyone. If something happened to them out there, it wasn't because they made a mistake. But in the weeks leading up to their disappearance, the crew had reported several unusual incidents that should have served as warnings. October 1987 had been marked by a series of disturbing reports from the Beacon Point crew. The lighthouse's radio equipment, used for communication with the mainland and passing ships, had been picking up signals that shouldn't exist. They were coming from underwater, Thomas Brennan had reported to Coast Guard headquarters. Not from submarines. We know what those sound like. These signals were different. Structured, repetitive, like someone was trying to communicate using our own frequency. The signals appeared on sonar as well. David Walsh, who monitored the lighthouse's fog detection equipment, documented patterns of movement on the seafloor that didn't match any known marine life or geological activity. There were shapes down there, Walsh had written in his final report to the Coast Guard. Large, metallic shapes moving in formations. They appeared on our instruments every night between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., then vanished before dawn. Michael Santos, the former Navy signalman, had attempted to decode the underwater signals using military encryption methods. His notes, found later in the lighthouse office, showed increasingly complex patterns that seemed to be responding to the lighthouse beam itself. The signals strengthen when the light passes over certain coordinates, Santos wrote. Whatever's down there is watching us. And I think it's learning our patterns. Robert Chen had been monitoring the lighthouse's electrical systems and noticed power fluctuations that coincided with the mysterious signals. The lighthouse drew its power from diesel generators, but the electrical readings showed energy surges that couldn't be explained by the equipment's normal operation. It's like something is feeding power into our systems, Chen had noted. The generators are producing 30% more electricity than they should be capable of generating. The extra power seems to be coming from an external source. Coast Guard engineers had been scheduled to investigate these reports, but the November storm arrived before any official inquiry could take place. November 12, 1987, brought one of the most severe storms in Maine maritime history. Hurricane-force winds and 40-foot waves battered the coast, forcing all shipping to seek shelter and grounding Coast Guard rescue operations. The lighthouse crew had prepared for the storm according to standard protocols. Emergency supplies were secured, backup generators were tested, and communication schedules were established with the mainland. The last radio contact with Beacon Point came at 9:30 p.m., when Thomas Brennan reported that all systems were operating normally despite the severe weather. Wind holding steady at 75 knots, waves 35 to 40 feet, Brennan had radioed. Lighthouse beam and fog signal operating at full capacity. All crew accounted for. Will report again at midnight. But midnight came and went with no communication from Beacon Point. Coast Guard operators attempted to raise the lighthouse crew every 30 minutes throughout the night, but received no response. The lighthouse beam continued to operate normally, visible through breaks in the storm clouds, suggesting that the equipment was still functioning. At 3:17 a.m., Coast Guard monitoring stations detected something extraordinary: a massive sonar signature directly beneath Beacon Point Island. The object was approximately 500 feet in length, 200 feet in width, and appeared to be rising from the ocean floor toward the surface. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen, said Chief Petty Officer Maria Rodriguez, who was monitoring sonar that night. The signature was too large and too regular to be geological. It moved with purpose, rising steadily from a depth of 800 feet to just 50 feet below the lighthouse. The sonar contact remained stationary for exactly 47 minutes, then descended back to the ocean floor and disappeared from all detection equipment. When the storm cleared at dawn on November 13th, rescue teams were dispatched to Beacon Point Island. What they found defied explanation. The lighthouse was intact and fully operational. The beam swept across the waters on schedule, the fog horn sounded its regular intervals, and all automated systems showed normal function. But the 4 keepers were nowhere to be found. It was like they had simply vanished into thin air, said Lieutenant Commander Sarah Foster, who led the first search team to reach the island. Their personal belongings were in their quarters, meals were half finished on the table, and the logbook showed entries right up until 11:45 p.m. But no people. The lighthouse's interior showed no signs of struggle or emergency. Tools were laid out for routine maintenance, weather instruments had been properly secured for the storm, and the radio equipment was functioning normally. Even more puzzling, the lighthouse had continued to operate automatically throughout the night, despite requiring manual intervention every few hours. Lighthouse operations in 1987 weren't fully automated, Foster explained. The beam required manual adjustment for visibility conditions, the fog signal needed monitoring for mechanical issues, and the generators required fuel checks every 4 hours. For the lighthouse to operate normally all night, someone would have had to be tending it. The search team found several disturbing clues in the lighthouse's operational areas. The light room, the massive Fresnel lens showed unusual residue on its surface, a crystalline substance that had formed perfect geometric patterns across the glass. The substance couldn't be identified by Coast Guard engineers. The radio room, communication equipment had been modified with additional components that weren't part of the lighthouse's standard configuration. Wiring had been extended to connect the radio to the lighthouse's foundation, as if someone had been trying to send signals through the bedrock itself. The generator room, power output readings showed the impossible energy surges that Robert Chen had documented. Electrical meters registered power levels that exceeded the generator's maximum capacity by 40%. The basement, below the lighthouse's main level, investigators found evidence that the keepers had been excavating through the island's foundation. Tools, drilling equipment, and piles of stone and earth suggested extensive digging had been taking place for weeks. Most disturbing of all, the basement excavation had revealed a perfectly circular shaft that descended straight down through the bedrock. The shaft was approximately 6 feet in diameter and dropped beyond the reach of flashlights. When investigators dropped weighted lines into the opening, they found no bottom within 200 feet. The Coast Guard launched a comprehensive investigation into the disappearance, but their findings only deepened the mystery. No evidence suggested the keepers had left the island voluntarily or been taken by force. All boats remained moored at the island's dock, emergency equipment was untouched, and personal valuables were left behind. The search expanded to include the waters around Beacon Point Island. Divers explored the area where the massive sonar contact had been detected, but found only normal seafloor formations. Whatever had risen from the depths during the storm had left no trace of its presence. "We searched every inch of that island and the surrounding waters," said Foster. "We brought in specialized equipment, underwater cameras, and even psychics that family members insisted we consult. Nothing. for experienced men had simply vanished from a lighthouse in the middle of a storm. The investigation was complicated by the discovery of additional modifications throughout the lighthouse that hadn't been reported by the keepers. The entire structure had been systematically altered over a period of months, with wiring, piping, and structural elements changed to create what appeared to be a massive antenna or transmission device. The lighthouse had been converted into something else, Foster reported. Every metal component had been connected to create a unified electrical system that extended from the light at the top to the excavated shaft in the basement. It was like the whole building had become a giant radio transmitter. Analysis of the crystalline residue found on the lens revealed an unknown mineral composition that didn't match any substance in geological databases. The material exhibited unusual properties. It conducted electricity more efficiently than copper, remained cool despite electrical current, and seemed to amplify light that passed through it. After 6 months of investigation, the Coast Guard concluded that the 4 keepers had likely been swept off the island by storm waves and drowned, despite the lack of any evidence supporting this theory. The lighthouse was decommissioned and abandoned, deemed too dangerous for human habitation. The official report was classified and sealed for national security reasons that were never explained to the families of the missing men. Following the disappearance, Beacon Point Lighthouse was permanently closed to maritime operations. The Coast Guard installed an automated beacon on the mainland to replace the island light, and Beacon Point was declared off-limits to civilian vessels. "They told us it was because of structural damage from the storm," said Betty Brennan, Thomas's widow. "But the lighthouse was perfectly intact. Ships could see it for miles. There was no reason to shut it down unless they were hiding something." The families of the missing keepers were offered substantial settlements by the Coast Guard and the Department of Transportation. The amounts were unusually large for maritime disappearances, $500,000 per family in 1987 dollars, but came with comprehensive non-disclosure agreements that prevented the families from discussing the case publicly. "They paid us to stay quiet," said Maria Santos, Michael's sister. "The money came with lawyers and contracts and warnings about national security. They made it clear that asking questions about what happened on that island would be dangerous for our own safety." Over the following years, several attempts were made to investigate Beacon Point Island independently. Marine archaeologists, paranormal researchers, and investigative journalists all sought permission to examine the lighthouse, but were denied access by federal authorities who cited ongoing environmental assessment as justification for the restrictions. In 1995, a team of marine biologists conducting research in the area reported unusual sonar readings from the waters around Beacon Point. Their research permit was immediately revoked, and their data was confiscated by federal agents who claimed the information was relevant to classified submarine operations. Anyone who got too close to that island or asked too many questions about what happened there found themselves facing legal problems, said investigative journalist David Kim, who attempted to cover the story in 2003. Funding would disappear, permits would be denied, and sometimes people would receive visits from federal agents who made it clear that pursuing the story was not in their best interests. For 37 years, Beacon Point Island remained abandoned, its lighthouse dark, slowly deteriorating under the harsh coastal weather. In March 2024, the Maine Department of Transportation announced plans to demolish the Beacon Point Lighthouse and sell the island for private development. The lighthouse had been structurally compromised by decades of weather exposure, and the cost of restoration exceeded the historical preservation budget. Demolition contractor Miguel Rodriguez was hired to carefully dismantle the lighthouse and prepare the island for sale. The work required removing the structure piece by piece to preserve materials that could be salvaged for historical exhibits. "The lighthouse looked abandoned from the outside," Rodriguez said. "But when we started taking it apart, we found modifications that shouldn't have existed. The entire interior had been rebuilt with equipment and wiring that wasn't part of the original construction." The demolition revealed the full extent of the changes made by the lighthouse keepers before their disappearance. Every level of the building had been systematically modified to create an integrated electrical and communication system that extended throughout the structure. But the most shocking discovery came when Rodriguez's team reached the basement level and found the circular shaft that investigators had noted in 1987. The opening had been sealed with concrete at some point after the original investigation, but demolition work cracked the seal and revealed that the shaft continued much deeper than originally thought. We dropped a weighted camera line down there and it kept going, Rodriguez said. At 500 feet we hit what looked like worked stone, artificial construction, not natural rock. At 800 feet the camera showed chambers and corridors carved into the bedrock. And at 1,000 feet we found them. The lighthouse keepers were still there 37 years after their disappearance. But they weren't alone. The camera footage from the shaft revealed a series of chambers carved into the bedrock beneath Beacon Point Island. The chambers were filled with a crystalline substance that had perfectly preserved everything within them, including the 4 missing lighthouse keepers. They looked like they had died yesterday, Rodriguez said. Their bodies were intact, their clothes were perfect, and they were positioned like they had been arranged rather than fallen. It was like someone had carefully placed them in specific positions before the preservation process began. But the keepers weren't the only occupants of the underground chambers. The camera revealed dozens of other human figures, all perfectly preserved in the same crystalline substance. Some appeared to be wearing clothing from different historical periods. Maritime uniforms from the early 1900s, civilian clothes from the 1950s, and modern gear from various eras. It was like a museum of missing people, Rodriguez said. All arranged in neat rows, all perfectly preserved, all staring upward toward the lighthouse above them. The FBI was called immediately, but their response was to classify the discovery and seal the shaft permanently. Rodriguez and his crew were sworn to secrecy and paid substantial sums to relocate their demolition work away from the lighthouse area. But Rodriguez had preserved video footage of the underground chambers, and what the footage revealed challenged everything investigators thought they knew about the Beacon Point disappearance. The preserved video footage showed that the chambers beneath Beacon Point Island were part of a vast underground complex that extended far beyond the lighthouse's foundation. Corridors carved into the bedrock connected multiple chambers, each filled with preserved human figures and sophisticated equipment that appeared to be centuries old. It wasn't just a burial site, said Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a marine archaeologist who analyzed the footage. It was a functioning facility. The chambers contained equipment that looked like a mixture of 19th-century maritime technology and devices that seemed far more advanced than anything we have today. The equipment included communication arrays, massive copper and crystal devices that appeared to be designed for long-range signal transmission and reception, preservation systems, complex crystallization equipment that maintained the perfect preservation of organic materials, monitoring devices, instruments that seemed designed to track surface activity and ocean movements, power generation, unknown energy sources that continued to operate despite being underground for decades. But the most disturbing discovery was evidence that the underground complex was still active. The video footage showed lights moving through the corridors, equipment that appeared to be functioning, and signs that the preserved figures were being systematically maintained by some form of automated system. Whatever created this facility was still operating it, Dr. Warren said. The lighthouse keepers didn't just disappear, they were collected and added to a preservation system that had been gathering people for over a century. Analysis of the preserved figures suggested that people had been disappearing in the Beacon Point area since the lighthouse was first constructed in 1884. Maritime records from the period showed dozens of unexplained disappearances, ship crews, coastal residents, and lighthouse personnel who had vanished without trace over more than 100 years. The lighthouse wasn't just guiding ships, Dr. Warren concluded. It was marking location for something else, something that had been systematically collecting human beings from the surface world and preserving them in the chambers below. Further analysis of the footage revealed the source of the mysterious signals that the lighthouse keepers had detected before their disappearance. Deep within the underground complex, beyond the preservation chambers, the camera had captured images of a massive metallic structure that appeared to be partially embedded in the bedrock. It wasn't built by humans, Dr. Warren said. The construction methods, the materials, the design principles, everything about it suggested a technology that was far beyond our current capabilities, possibly beyond our understanding. The structure appeared to be some form of transmission device, with crystalline components that pulsed with regular patterns of light. The signals that the lighthouse keepers had detected were emanating from this device, which seemed to be using the lighthouse above as an amplification system. The modifications made by the keepers weren't their idea, Dr. Warren explained. They were being guided to convert the lighthouse into part of a larger communication system. The signals they detected were instructions, teaching them how to enhance the facility's transmission capabilities. The underground device appeared to be attempting to communicate with something beneath the ocean floor. Sonar analysis of the preserved footage showed that the signals were directed downward, through the bedrock, toward a target approximately 5,000 feet below the island. "There's something down there," Dr. Warren said. "Something large, artificial, and responsive to the signals from the underground complex." The lighthouse keepers weren't just casualties, they were recruited to help establish communication with whatever lies beneath the ocean floor. The massive sonar contact detected during the 1987 storm hadn't been rising from the ocean floor. It had been responding to signals from the lighthouse, following instructions transmitted through the underground device. The preserved documentation found in the underground chambers revealed that the disappearances at Beacon Point followed a systematic collection protocol that had been operating for over a century. People weren't randomly selected. They were chosen based on specific criteria that made them useful for maintaining the underground facility. It was selective recruitment, Dr. Warren said. The preservation system needed people with particular skills: maritime knowledge, electrical expertise, communication abilities, and mechanical training. The lighthouse keepers were perfect candidates because they possessed all of these capabilities. The collection process appeared to work through psychological manipulation rather than physical force. People selected for preservation were gradually influenced to modify their environment in ways that enhanced the underground facility's capabilities. The lighthouse keepers had unknowingly been converting their station into a more effective communication array. They thought they were investigating mysterious signals, Dr. Warren explained. In reality, they were being trained to improve the very system that was planning to collect them. Their curiosity and technical skills made them ideal candidates for preservation. The preservation process itself wasn't immediate death. It was gradual integration into the underground facility's operating system. The preserved figures weren't corpses, but maintained human operators who continued to function as part of the complex's automated systems. "They're still alive in there," Dr. Warren said. "The crystalline preservation maintains biological function while integrating consciousness into the facility's control network." The lighthouse keepers became permanent operators of a system they had helped to construct. The underground complex appeared to be designed for long-term operation, with preserved human operators providing the intelligence and adaptability needed to interact with the surface world. Each new addition to the collection brought additional skills and knowledge that enhanced the facility's capabilities. The most disturbing revelation from the underground complex was evidence that the signals being transmitted into the ocean depths were receiving responses. The facility's communication logs, partially preserved in the crystalline chambers, showed decades of signal exchanges with something located far beneath the ocean floor. "It wasn't just broadcasting," Dr. Warren said. "It was having conversations." The device beneath Beacon Point was part of a communication network that extended deep into the Earth's crust, possibly connecting to similar facilities in other locations. Analysis of the signal patterns suggested that the underground complex was reporting on surface activities to receivers located in submarine installations throughout the Atlantic Ocean. The lighthouse had served as both an observation post and a communication relay, monitoring maritime traffic and coastal activities for an unknown intelligence. The lighthouse keepers weren't just victims, Dr. Warren explained. They were witnesses to surface world activities that someone or something needed to monitor. Their maritime knowledge, combined with their isolation on the island, made them perfect observers of ship movements, weather patterns, and coastal activities. The signal logs indicated that similar collection and monitoring operations were active at multiple coastal locations. Lighthouse disappearances, maritime mysteries, and unexplained coastal phenomena dating back to the 1800s all showed patterns consistent with the Beacon Point system. "It's a network," Dr. Warren concluded. "Beacon Point is just one node in a monitoring system that extends along the entire eastern seaboard. Wherever there are isolated lighthouse installations, coastal observation posts, or maritime communication facilities, there are probably similar underground complexes collecting observers and reporting to something beneath the ocean." The 1987 storm hadn't caused the lighthouse keepers' disappearance. It had provided cover for their final collection into a system that had been observing and recruiting them for months. When Dr. Warren attempted to publish her findings about the Beacon Point underground complex, she discovered that federal agencies had been monitoring her research from the beginning. Her university funding was terminated, her research materials were confiscated, and she was informed that discussing her discoveries would violate national security regulations. They knew about the complex all along, Dr. Warren said. The 1987 investigation wasn't trying to find the missing keepers. It was trying to suppress evidence of what had collected them. The federal government has been protecting this system for decades. The FBI's immediate response to the 2024 discovery wasn't investigation but containment. The underground complex was sealed permanently, the demolition site was declared a federal environmental hazard zone, and all personnel involved in the discovery were required to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements. Miguel Rodriguez, the demolition contractor who had first discovered the preserved keepers, was paid $2 million to relocate his operations and never discuss what he had found beneath the lighthouse. His crew members received similar payments and legal threats that ensured their silence. The same agencies that covered up the disappearance in 1987 are still protecting the system today, Dr. Warren said. They're not trying to solve the mystery, they're trying to keep it operational. Federal oceanographic surveys conducted around Beacon Point Island after the 2024 discovery showed extensive submarine construction activities in the area. New installations were being built on the ocean floor, apparently expanding the network that the lighthouse complex had been designed to serve. They're not shutting it down, Dr. Warren concluded. They're upgrading it. Whatever's beneath the ocean floor is still active, still collecting observers, and still expanding its monitoring capabilities along the coast. Investigation into similar lighthouse disappearances along the eastern seaboard revealed that the Beacon Point incident wasn't unique. Between 1987 and 2024, at least 17 lighthouse installations had reported unexplained disappearances of their crews, equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained, and mysterious signal activity that defied conventional analysis. It's still happening, Dr. Warren said. The collection protocol that took the Beacon Point keepers is still active at lighthouse installations from Maine to Florida. Modern automated systems have reduced the need for human lighthouse crews, but isolated maritime installations still experience unexplained disappearances. Current targets include research stations, oceanographic installations conducting deep-sea research, weather monitoring, isolated meteorological stations on coastal islands, communication arrays, maritime radio and radar installations, Coast Guard facilities, remote outposts with small crews and minimal oversight. The modern operations appear to be more sophisticated than the 1987 Beacon Point collection. Instead of obvious disappearances, personnel at targeted facilities report gradual changes in behavior, unexplained technical modifications to equipment, and increasing obsession with monitoring underwater activities. They're still being recruited, Dr. Warren explained. The process has become more subtle, but the goal remains the same: identify skilled personnel, train them to enhance monitoring capabilities, then integrate them into the underground preservation system. Federal maritime authorities continue to classify all reports of unusual activity at coastal installations. Personnel who report mysterious signals, equipment modifications, or behavioral changes among their colleagues are routinely transferred to inland positions or retired early with substantial benefits packages. In November 2024, exactly 37 years after the original disappearance, the Beacon Point Lighthouse was officially demolished. The structure was carefully dismantled and the materials were transported to undisclosed federal storage facilities for historical preservation purposes. But residents of the Maine coast report that on clear nights, a light can still be seen from the location where the lighthouse once stood. The beam sweeps across the water on the same schedule the lighthouse had maintained for over a century, despite the fact that no structure exists to house the light source. The families of the 4 lighthouse keepers continue to honor the non-disclosure agreements they signed in 1987. The substantial settlements they received have been supplemented over the years with additional payments to ensure their continued silence about what happened on Beacon Point Island. But sometimes, maritime radio operators monitoring coastal frequencies report strange signals that seem to originate from the vicinity of the former lighthouse. The transmissions contain structured patterns that suggest intelligent communication, but the content remains impossible to decode using conventional methods. "They're still out there," said former Coast Guard operator Maria Rodriguez, who detected the massive sonar contact during the 1987 storm. "Whatever took those lighthouse keepers is still active, still monitoring our coastal activities, and still recruiting new observers from isolated maritime installations. The underground complex beneath Beacon Point Island remains sealed, but sonar surveys of the area show that construction activities continue deep beneath the ocean floor. New chambers are being excavated, new equipment is being installed, and new preserved figures are being added to the collection. The lighthouse keepers who vanished in 1987 weren't just victims of a maritime mystery, they were recruited into a monitoring system that continues to observe and influence human activities along the coast. Their technical skills, maritime knowledge, and isolated location made them perfect candidates for preservation in a network that extends far beneath the ocean floor. The most terrifying truth about the Beacon Point Lighthouse disappearance isn't that 4 men vanished during a storm. It's that they're still working their shifts 37 years later in chambers beneath the sea, tending lights that guide vessels we can't see toward destinations we don't understand. And somewhere along the coast tonight, another lighthouse keeper is detecting mysterious signals, making unexplained modifications to equipment, and beginning to suspect that the ocean is watching them back. The light still burns beneath the waves. The keepers still tend their watch. And the collection continues. The end. Subscribe to Lost Mystery Stories for more maritime mysteries, underwater discoveries, and the coastal phenomena that hide beneath our familiar shores. Because sometimes, the most dangerous lights are the ones that guide us into the darkness.